The absolute worst thing that I sometimes see happening is what I call ERP theatre, where the the ERP's there, but if you want to know what's really going on, don't look in the ERP.
Yeah.
So you've got people kind of doing, I call them like drug deals, where they're like, have you got the latest product file? Yeah, here you go. Sort of gets passed around the back. Oh, what products are we launching? Oh, have a look here. Rather than actually driving that data from the real-time source of, you've got how many have been ordered. It's in the ERP with the purchase orders. That's where everybody should be going, but they're not. They're relying on these little backhanded.
We see that when our implementation team starts migrating data and they're like, yes, let's start moving this data from the legacy ERP system. And they go in and like, there's no data in here. They've been using it as a glorified QuickBooks. So the ERP is implemented, but it's not being used as a single source of truth, and it's all in spreadsheets.
That's the ERP theatre. So welcome to Behind the Stack, a limited series podcast between myself and the guys at Fulfil ERP. I'm here with ST shooting episode 1, and it's going to be a podcast with a bit of a twist. Instead of focusing on all the nice fluffy stuff and all the front end things, we're going to go behind the scenes and then go a little bit deeper than most seem to be prepared to go. So if you're someone that's interested in learning more about what goes on behind the scenes and is relatable to you because you're working in an operational role, or you're working for a vendor and you want to understand more about this space and what some of the leading people in those roles are working on, this is going to be a great podcast for you.
All right. Why are we here?
We're here to go a little bit deeper than most things seems to go into the back office, the boring stuff. We think it's the sexy stuff.
For us nerds, maybe.
Yeah, for us, it's the sexy stuff.
Who do we want to focus on? Is this for someone who's just starting an e-com brand, 8-figure brands, 7-figure brands, 9-figure brands?
One of the challenges with being more on the tech side is often people don't know what you're talking about. When we go into a room and people start like throwing acronyms around, like ERP or PIM or whatever, the number of times I've said an acronym like PIM to someone that runs a business, not a small business, like tens of millions in revenue in our industry, and they go, what's a PIM? And like look at you completely bemused. Like that's the effect that we can have on people. It's like magic. But yeah, I think it's finding a way to talk about those subjects, but like going back to first principles of what are we really talking about, covering the intro and the basics, but then actually getting down into the detail with people that really know their stuff on that area. And I think you can make those things relatable if we've got people that have like got stories of how they've done it and what it's actually meant to their business, to kind of bring it back into the world for everybody else.
Are we going to talk about marketing?
We're not going to talk about marketing. We're not going to talk about paid media. We're probably not going to talk about, we're going to talk about CAC.
Are we?
No.
ROAS?
Yeah, they're the equivalent acronyms for the front end, and we're forced to learn what they all are, but no one knows the back end ones.
Okay, so this is definitely a boring pod.
Yeah, this is the really boring back end behind the scenes podcast. You're going to hate it.
All right. Sounds like fun. So, what makes you qualified to talk about this?
What makes me qualified to talk about this? I'm probably more qualified to talk about this than anything else in my life. I don't know if that's a good measure of whether I'm qualified to talk about it. I was one of the founding team at Peoplevox, a warehouse system. So I was fully committed to the world of the warehouse and the system for over 10 years. I think that innings qualifies me at least for the episodes we're doing on warehouse management. And that was kind of where I first came across Fulfil, to be fair.
Did we compete?
We were competing a little bit, maybe back in like 2016, 2017. I think like you started from a similar angle and like you tackled the warehouse, which is like the hardest bit, I think, personally. But that was all we ever got past. So maybe the other stuff's way harder, but you tackled the warehouse, which most ERPs really struggle with. Like they often come from that like financial background and then they try and work out the warehouse later.
Yeah.
And then you're deciding how the warehouse should work based on how the financial system works. When I was selling against NetSuite, you'd look at the warehouse flows and you'd be in a situation where you literally couldn't do something because it was like having this knock-on effect on basically running all the way back to the financial system. So it's like, oh, you can't move that there because that's going to break everything in all the reporting. So yeah, that was my first like awareness of Fulfil, but I don't think we crossed over too much in that period. Like we were pretty focused on the UK and Australia and New Zealand. And then, left Peoplevox in 2020 after we were acquired, and went into PLM for a year, product lifecycle management. So that was my fulfillment side and all the customer experience, this like big circle. And then I thought like e-commerce was quite automated and everybody was like eliminating paper and people weren't running loads of Google Sheets. And then I started speaking to merchandisers and designers in this PLM setting. And I realized like nothing made sense in terms of how, the idea that you kind of have a tech stack and all these things kind of sit around it and all fit in, it's just nothing works. Like everything overlaps, nothing really made sense. And yes, that's been my life really from doing that PLM, that problem of like what I call the dark stack of Google Sheets and Excel files. That's like
Dark stack. That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, the dark stack. I've at least coined one term. People do say dark stack back to me. I'm like, I've invented something. That's amazing. People call it shadow stack is the other term, but I'll take dark stack. But yeah, just that problem. And then co-founded Nolo Apps 2 years ago with Vic, who's my co-founder. And we've been playing around with Airtable in the first year that we'd worked together. I was just very focused on trying to eliminate all these Excel files and Google Sheets. And the first brands that I worked with when I was doing consulting, the immediate thing I saw was that they actually had more Excel files and Google Sheets if they had an ERP than if they didn't have an ERP. And that completely blew my mind. And it's that like, how do you go from complete flexibility of a spreadsheet and perceived agility to then adopting the more rigid structure and processes around an ERP? And that's that middle layer there that I've just described is kind of where we try and play with Nolo. So yeah, I guess that's the connection here of like why Nolo and Fulfil. It's trying to bring those two worlds together somewhere in between a Google Sheet and an ERP.
And some duct tape.
And some duct tape. Well, also make automations, however makes it happen. I think that's the interesting thing of like having all these different tools now. Probably 5-6 years ago, that idea that you would have all these different tools and you could get them all to work together, it was technically possible, but like just the tech wasn't easy enough for people who weren't technical to do it. And if you don't have technical people inside your business, and most brands don't, who's doing that technical work? Once you start bringing in third parties to do every single little bit of automation you need, the cost of it just like spirals through the roof anyway.
Makes sense.
So when did you start Fulfil then? I picked you up around like 2016, 2017.
Yeah, that was probably just around 2 years, 3 years from when we started. So 10 years back, 2015 is when we started. And I think you picked up on how we went a completely different route. Instead of starting with the GL as the foundation, having implemented NetSuite and other ERP systems, that ended up being the biggest challenge for us, where getting an operational workflow to communicate to the system would almost always be complex just because the GL stood in the way. So we realized this is yet another operations heavy industry, and where we need to start is ops first, and then the ops feeds the GL, not the other way around. So that's probably why you saw us competing a little bit with you guys.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, I did pick up on that. That was like the tackling the fulfillment piece head on and then trying to work back the other way. Like every ERP since the dawn of time has been really like a glorified accounting system migrating across and going into trying to be a more operational led thing. I think you've seen it a few times. Like you're certainly not the only tech vendor in the ERP space in retail to attempt that strategy, but you've certainly like pulled it off on the larger scale, I would say. I guess that where that shows the most is in the size of customer that you can handle.
Yeah, I think we started working together with Wild here, right, in the UK.
Yeah.
It's a good example of a company that operates at that scale, where anything that you put together has to work not just to solve that problem, but that solve that problem at a very, very large scale.
It was a really interesting brief from the team at Wild, where they do like over 2 million packages a year. So super high volume, multiple warehouses, multiple Shopify stores. And it was really just around how do we do this without like, they just had a lot of vendors in the mix. And they just on a mission really to try and consolidate that. Like there must be a more simple way to do it. You asked me earlier, like, why do you get involved and still do like odd bits of tech advisory here and there? Like, what's the thing that draws you back to it? And I'm always saying to myself, I need to stop doing it because we've got plenty going on with Nolo, and on that side of things, the business actually doesn't need me to do it, but it is the thing that I really do just enjoy doing, that I love looking at new vendors and trying to figure things out. I kind of view it all as like this big puzzle that you're trying to piece together, but you know that all the pieces aren't there. So you're trying to figure out, like, as a bit emerges, how does it come together? And really, though, it was they brought it back to I think it was Arthur, the CFO at Wild, brought it back to the table. They'd looked at you previously a couple of years before. And I think really my role in that became more of like just trying to help with the due diligence around trying to think a little bit like, I've been a vendor and I've been in your shoes. So like, whilst you'll have many people that buy and implement Fulfil, but they don't know what it's like to be a software vendor. And I felt like what I was trying to bring into that situation was, at least from their side, reading what was actually going on with you, because expanding from, you've got massive clients in the US and Canada, but expanding into the UK is a slightly different beast. And we did it with Peoplevox, but very, very different product and way less complicated to nationalize if you're not actually hitting things like accounting.
You know what? I think that's what makes us a little bit qualified to have this conversation. Day in and day out, if we look at our calendars, we are just talking to brands, solving operational problems for them. 8 and 9 figure brands. They may look similar from the Shopify store, but they are completely different businesses when you look behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's true. You get they don't know what they don't know. And you probably speak to, literally hundreds of brands a year, and you get the full tech stack meltdown, and you get the play by play. You see decisions that get made, and then how that plays out, and you get someone signs up for something and you think, oh, okay, maybe that's the way to go. And then you hear 6 months later, they're no longer on that something anymore. So you actually see things end to end a little bit. And in, particularly for a lot of people inside a brand, if you're just in a brand and that's all you know, and it's almost like you're living it once. Whereas as you're working across everybody, you're literally living it hundreds of times and hearing how people are getting on with things.
Yeah. And everyone thinks that they're special too. So they're out. It's not the generic ops like anyone else's. Our brand is special. That's probably what makes these brands unique. But to scale, they probably need to have some of this standardization that we get to see as we work with different brands and solving some of the similar problems across the board.
Yeah, it's interesting. I try and think. There was one of our clients, he gave me a really nice analogy around this, which was if everybody operated the same, then they'd have to have exactly the same strategies. So ultimately your tech strategy and how that relates to how you operate is your strategy in action. And it does need to have a little bit of a unique flavor. It's just working out, are you really unique in something that you're doing, or are you trying to reinvent the wheel because you're looking at it through your lens that you've evolved in?
You know what this reminds me of? There's this brand that I visited just 2 weeks back, and multi-brand, a consolidation of different brands. And the really, really strange thing for me was their websites cross-sold products, but only a very small subset of the products. They could be doing a lot more if they cross-sold all of their products. Then you start with this question, why exactly is this subset of the products here? And then it eventually boils down to how the warehouse is organized, because that's how the products are. So you have your physical products in the pictures from one brand, and you have the adjacent products that are right next to it. So your warehouse layout is now dictating how marketing goes about selling products. It just blows my mind how tightly coupled both of these things are, and how that limits the brand from
and there's the complete opposite of that, right? Which would be everything being so tightly integrated that because you're doing a launch, the warehouse bring forward the pallets of XYZ SKU and they bring it down and it's all ready to go by the pack bench and it's all ready to go out the door. That's the opposite. That opposite almost never happens. I remember I was in Australia at Princess Polly. Well, they're in the US now. I don't know what group they became part of. I can't remember. I was stood in their warehouse and they'd done one of the first big launches with this makeup artist.
Okay.
And they had done it well. They actually had like this pallets of this box were like in different pallets all around the way. I had no idea what I was turning up to there, and they had like 15,000 orders for this like makeup box. They had absolutely no time to talk to me that day. They were just super busy rushing around doing it. But yeah, that happens, and you got to be in it, like actually be in a warehouse to see what that's like.
We definitely need to bring someone on board who can talk about these things. These are kind of things that no one shares, how they got that, 30,000 order drop out of the door. Everyone talks about what ad campaigns they ran and how successful that campaign was. But how the hell did you get all these products out of the door?
Well, the other story where they're like, oh yeah, that big drop you did. Yeah, that you told us about 24 hours in advance, and we only had half of the products.
I can think of a couple of people who could talk about those horror stories. Yeah, what happens when marketing decides the day before Black Friday that the right thing to do for the business would be to bundle 3 different products and ship it out, and an entire warehouse that's ready for single picks now suddenly has to ship bundles out. Yeah, we'll get people to talk about those stories.
Yeah, one of my good friends that I did meet down in Australia, he always talks like his worst ever story is an overselling story where they oversold like 1,500 orders basically on a launch. I think the way it was working, the integration was running, you know exactly where I'm going now.
Yes.
Do a big launch, more volume than you're expecting, and the round trip between the website and the ERP, or the website and the WMS, or the 3PL, whatever, it wasn't running fast enough.
Race conditions.
Yeah, so it was coming down, resetting the stock, selling out more, then it was going back and updating more stock on, and it was just going on and on and on, and it did that for about an hour. So yeah, 1,500 orders, took them 2.5 weeks to unpick it and burn through that, when like all the customer emails and all the back and forth.
Refunds, apologies.
Yeah, that's scarring stuff really. But like that, I think that was almost standard practice. If you go back 10 years ago, it was like every brand would do that at some point in their journey, or even like, longer, show my age, 15 years ago. That was just what people were doing, because they were taking tech that wasn't made for e-commerce.
Yeah.
Or it was like a retail system. It was all very nationalized. So you bought whatever was big in your country. That's what I mean by nationalized. So in the UK, we had all sorts of these retail systems, and you just put that in, and that's the thing that you'd use, because there just wasn't anything that was actually tailor-made. So yeah, those things were just really common fare. So that's like some of the warehouse examples. What's the finance equivalent of like an oversell?
Recognizing revenue based on Shopify payouts, which is surprisingly common. Because if you take Shopify's payouts, it's just recognition of cash. It's almost like, hey, we collected all this money on behalf of you, and here's a deposit to your bank, and we cut our fees.
Yeah.
That's all that payout is. But when you have an external bookkeeping company doing the books for you, it's just far easier for them to use that payout to recognize revenue. And that's almost a revenue recognition on cash basis. There are strict limits to it in the US. Even IRS doesn't allow it. Canada, anywhere close to $1 million, you're required to do that. Same with the UK. So it's not a accepted practice at all. It's not even GAAP-compliant. So the first time you start hearing about this is when you go and present your statements and ask for a loan from a lender. That's when they're going to start digging into this and say, hey, this is not proper revenue recognition. Or when you have a board, that's when you start seeing these things happen. Until then, you get around. I would say this is a strong equivalent of us.
So for clarity, when should we be recognizing revenue?
Always when the items have been shipped. The GAAP requires you only when the control of the inventory leaves from you as a business to the customer. That's when you recognize revenue. So there are some principles on revenue recognition, but if you have to boil it down, when you ship the items is when you recognize revenue.
So that's pretty hard. So the alternative is basically they're just looking at cash into the bank rather than looking at where they fulfilled the service.
Yeah. So you can do that if you're a cash basis accounting business, but there are strict upper limits to how long you can do cash basis accounting.
Yeah.
That's really, really meant for small businesses, small stores, shops, not for a DTC brand that's scaling.
Yeah, makes sense.
SKUs seem like one of the most basic things that every brand should get right. What mistakes do you see when people set up products and SKUs or?
Yeah, so SKU setup, there's a common trap that people fall into. The worst one I'd say that anyone could watch out for is, let's take a fashion example. So most companies in fashion will work like style, colorway, and then size, whatever. So you've got, let's say, styles 001, and then colorway might be, black might be BLK. Sometimes what you find is that they don't use like black or red. They'll use a color code. And so whilst they're working in development, let's say they're working on a new dress, they're thinking this dress is going to be pink. Now, at the start of the process, the designers are trying to work out what color it's actually going to be. They might have like 4 different colors that they're working with, all different shades of pink. And all of those different shades of pink have got a different color name, right? Merchandising at some point need to place a purchase order. So like in the Fulfil world, they need to create the SKU and raise a purchase order to send it to a supplier. So what happens is if they're not working in like clear color groups, if you're putting in like the exact shade of, let's say you call it rose, and you put, I'm going to need different pinks here. I'm going to struggle further on. Let's say we've got
pink 1 and pink 2.
Yeah, no, we've got baby pink and we've got rose. I've got a couple in my locker. So it starts as baby pink. So we put like BP in the name, or maybe baby pink. We give a new color number of 005 or something. Then what happens is the order gets made, but development's still happening. I think this is one of the things that most people that haven't really been behind the scenes in product development, it's really hard to understand that even at the point of purchase order, it might not all still be figured out yet. And so, lab dips come back from the factory. Okay, we're actually going to do this. We're not going to do this in baby pink now. We're going to do it in rose. So the color gets changed to rose from baby pink and the SKU code gets changed. Yeah. This is surprisingly common, right? I actually know of this happening in a brand more than 50 million in the last 18 months where they actually like finally got their arms around this probably needs to stop happening now. And so what you do is you change it in the, normally SKUs are in like a Google Sheet or an Excel file. So change it in there, and then we'll go and change it in ERP, and then we need to go and change it in the warehouse system, and then we need to go and change it in Shopify. And that's all happening around the point. It could even be like much further down the line, because sometimes these color decisions on like naming convention even. So if you didn't use a code, let's say you did a color, the naming convention might not even get changed until like right before the launch. And so at that point, they're literally in the final throes of trying to get, it's not hard enough to try and launch stuff. They're going through and trying to change all the colors, keep things updated. There is a solution though.
What is your recommendation though, before you go there?
Yeah.
Do you recommend having the color codes as part of the SKU, or is your recommendation that the only thing that should vary is the style?
No, they like it in fashion. They like a little human readable and
SKUs.
That's okay in the SKU. Yeah, they like a color. Even like if you're not going to do a shortened name, well, it's the same approach, whether you do a shortened name or whether you do a color code. We create, the thing that we've often done is have a design color and a merch color. So you let merch dictate what the SKU code is, and they work on like a color group. So it will be pink, and then design can call it whatever they want. You just set that up as a separate attribute. So when it goes through to the website, design is still having it called baby pink or rose pink. It's not going through as pink.
This used to be my recommendation. I don't do that anymore.
What do you do now?
So there's a story behind that. So we have a customer that does wedding dresses. And the first time the PO went out, it was good. So, color code was all right.
Yeah.
The second time the PO went out, it was the exact same SKU, but the color was slightly different. Now, when it's a wedding order and it's bridesmaids dresses, you mix 2 of them from the slight color difference. Now, there's no way I'm going to be able to tell the difference between the 2 pinks, but people can.
Yeah.
And your customers are going to be totally mad at you.
Yeah.
So that's the time I decided that this is not a recommendation I'm making anymore. I prefer these days that, especially apparel brands, the only variation should be on style, is on the size, and the style is a combination of the color as well. So if the product is going to change even slightly by pink changes from one shade of pink to the next one, it's a new style.
Yeah.
You want to substitute the product and ship it. If you don't have these kind of constraints, that's okay. But if you will end up in a situation where a customer is going to buy a bunch of these, and that color variation is going to be a problem, this will run you into trouble. So since then, I've been of the opinion that even if the shade changes a little bit, I'd rather have it as a new SKU.
Oh no, we're aligned on that. So if it changes, it was more like before it's even launched the first time, they haven't decided it. Like we actually got this first with a French client that we work with called From Future. And everything they do is like ice wool and cashmere. So it's all about dyeing and lab dips and stuff. So the changing for them and that merch and design color, that is strictly in new product development. Once a product's gone live,
any changes,
it's done. Any changes, you go back through. But that's a contentious issue. Even like people hate changing SKU codes or like doing versioning and all that kind of stuff. It can get.
That's also the tricky part, right? Like with platforms, depending on where your e-com platform is, suddenly you lose your sales history when you launch a new SKU. So it does introduce some problems, and that's where having the same style at least helps you aggregate them together or grouping them together to see the data together even when it changes. So there's no good answer. This is one of those things that really, really depends on the type of the business.
Yeah.
And that's where the nuances are.
Yeah. That little piece of that product data structure and hierarchy, I knew nothing about that 3 years ago. And now I've got like these hierarchies imprinted in my brain with all these lines going between different boxes. Because if you don't nail that foundational product data set and then work out how it's going to flow into everything else, or if you want to change it again later, it's really difficult to do so. And most brands don't even think about it until it's too late.
I once walked into a brand, I think that was doing about 95 million a year, US. And the most shocking thing for me was what they were calling a SKU was the style. And we could not have a conversation because it always just would confuse everybody in the room. So, and the entire company and all of their spreadsheets, all of their systems, everything is used to the SKU being the style. So I had to start from, okay, guys, if we say SKU, this is where what a SKU is.
That like taxonomy is one of the hardest things. I think like it's hard as well. I don't know how many people you brought into Fulfil, not from e-commerce. Probably quite a few at this stage.
Quite a few.
Yeah. It's like, that's one of the hardest bits, I think, for people coming in, just to like, I think probably less so in like more technical roles. Cause I know certainly from some of our team, it's just like, they almost just see everything as a schema anyway. And they're just trying to work out how it all fits. And they're like, oh, they're the relationships. Yeah, fine, I'm done. I think in non-technical roles, it's just that's all a lot. And then every single person you speak to is a different word for the same thing.
Yeah.
Even take like shipments, consignments, inbound shipments, some people call it.
Supplier shipments.
Transfer, supplier shipments, containers.
Vendor, supplier.
Packing list. The packing list. So those people just say packing list and they just mean inbound shipment. So yeah, there's no consistency on any of that stuff. And then you throw in the name of all of the Excel files and the Google Sheets, and it's truly like a whole world of its own.
How do you help customers standardize that?
Like the naming conventions.
Yeah. Do you push a standardization in that, or do you just adapt your work to meet what the merchant is doing?
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, that's one of the flexibilities of Airtable is like, if people don't want us to call the product table product, they want to call it colorway, we can. And so I think adapting that is a really important part of what we do. A big difference around, if I was to compare like the work that people tend to do in Airtable versus what they're doing in Fulfil, like a lot of it within Airtable is a lot more down to how the person wants to run the process.
Yeah.
Like they're outside of that standardized world. Maybe they're in a slightly more creative role, or they're handing off between people, or they're using their workflow to drive a meeting that they're running. So it's really hard to tell someone like how they should run a meeting and what layout they should have and what they want to call things. And it's also, I think, one of the advantages is just meeting people where they are on naming conventions. Like as hard as it is to get your head around it. Like I just had a call with a French client and I went into their app. I was like, oh, everything's changing here. You've cleaned it all up. She's like, yeah, I've translated everything now. She translated everything and put emojis against everything as well, which seems to be a really important part of naming conventions that I find.
Emojis, for a while, this was one of our biggest challenges because customers love emojis. When they check out, they'll put a name and a sunshine right next to it. Says, I'm sure it's a very cheerful person. The order comes in. We try to generate a shipping label with UPS. UPS doesn't like it. And we have so much code in Fulfil that removes and replaces characters, emojis with something more deliverable.
I remember like Chinese characters being a real challenge at one point for the parcel carriers. And I assume that's been fixed by most systems. But yeah, emojis was another threat.
There are still some carriers that don't support anything of that sort.
Yeah, carrier software is possibly like, that's some true like relic stuff though, isn't it? Like, yeah.
Chinese carriers, there's a mutual customer that we work with. And one of my favorite stories is how for a long period of time, I tried to tell them, hey, I know you love your customers. Writing gift messages by hand is not going to scale. You should try printing them. And they're like, no, one of our unique things about our brand is we always print them. And some customers would write message as Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and so on. When that happens, you now have to find somebody in the team who's capable of writing that out. At one point, they're like, okay, this is not working. We can't hold a shipment because we need somebody to be able to write this. And then they started printing those gift messages from the system.
Can you do that in Fulfil?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, there was an API solution that could do that, like that printed gift messaging stuff. Cool. That's a cool native feature. That's a really nice addition. Was that like someone screaming, I've got to be able to do this? Or was that just a logical thing of like watching someone in the warehouse, like, are you going to keep doing that no matter what we do? Like, do we need to automate this, or is this going to be...
One of the early brands that we brought on board is this company based out of Washington called Lynch Creek Farms. Super unique business. They only operate during Q4 because it's Christmas wreaths. So they ramp up from about 10 full-time employees, I think, to about 400 people in about 2 weeks. And then they ship through October, November, and December. Right when carriers stop picking up packages for Christmas delivery, they stop operating. Now, most of their orders would be unique in this way that almost every wreath is a gift.
Yeah.
And almost every order is you shipping gifts to multiple people. So each order is multiple deliveries as well.
Okay.
So super unique business.
It is weird.
Yeah. And that's what I think helped us realize the importance of getting gift messages right and having that work really well. So, you know what? I think we should bring them on board the bar. Like scaling from 10 to 400 employees and how to make that operation work.
That's big. And also, did you say they're one of your early customers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was having a few like flashbacks to my earliest clients at Peoplevox, and it's like when you're in that really early stage, you're just so hungry to work with stuff, and you're just going in and you think you've landed on these, like you get these big opportunities, you're like, oh my God, I've landed it here. What you don't realize is that most of the established have like looked at it and gone, this deal's crazy. What they want is completely bizarre and out there, but like you're just at that stage where you're just like, yeah, we'll figure this out. We'll work this out. We'll make something of it.
I guess that's how every software company should be built. Like you go in, you solve some unique and random problem no major software vendor wants to solve, and then you learn a bunch of things and you build a product around it. It would screw it up too though, because if you start saying yes to everything that comes by and don't standardize, you also end up being everything for everyone and then nothing.
That's the challenge. Like, I think of it now as like, I don't know if you ever seen a guy, Dave Gerhardt, who was at Drift. He's great. I followed him for a long time, and he used to talk about like finding your wedge. Mm-hmm. So the nice thing about a lot of what he talked about was like, you know, Drift was in the live chat space. And like live chat was already a massive thing. There was loads of marketing and sales tools. So it's like, where do you start out? And they just found their little wedge of the market and then built their way out from there. So I think like just having a starting point and like you said, like just finding a little edge around an existing solution and working your way in is a great place to start.
This is also one of those customers that had such tight shipping requirements because they operate during this small window of time, shipping tens of thousands of packages a day, filling containers that go out. You can't have a downtime for even a minute because if you do, then they're probably going to miss some shipments that they could be shipping the same day. So I guess it also helped us design a lot for the scale we are in.
That's your like standout, I'd say, of everything that I've seen on Fulfil. That's like the standout thing that you've made a 10 out of 10. Like if you're going to look across your like strategy as a whole, volume and speed of scale up is like the 10 out of 10. That was something that we talked about a lot of Peoplevox, is like that was a real strength that we found versus a lot of established warehouse systems, and also like just the retail systems trying to adapt can do it, and also the generic tools that aren't built for e-commerce, they think they want that and then they get it. I mean, we had a client that went to like literally 100,000 orders a day and they got an overage bill for their database, for their ERP of like 1.2 million US dollars for a quarter of like, oh, this is your overage for the data. You've used too much data. Yeah. Who looks at their like data allowance when they're buying a piece of software? You're looking at all these forms and features and functions. You don't think like, how many gigabytes am I allowed? And then you discover like, oh, I've got to pay an overage on storing that stuff. It's crazy.
There are companies that bill by kilobytes used.
Bill by storage.
Not storage, transmissions, EDI. EDI vendors, there are still a bunch that charge by either the number of documents sent or by the kilobytes transmitted.
Yeah, I think it's all vogue though. Like I remember thinking, like straddling the two worlds like we are, of this SaaS world and this e-commerce world. On the one hand, you're in SaaS and everyone's talking about usage-based pricing and that's the future and people only pay for what they use for and you shouldn't charge per user and all of this. Nothing catches a trend and then tries to convince you everything should be done that way like SaaS does. Like the way marketers get behind things, define a new category and like try and drag everyone there. It's like usage-based pricing. You know what I mean though, right? Of like usage-based pricing is a thing. Amazon's doing it. Everybody should be doing it. All the VCs are saying to their investments, how are you doing usage-based pricing? You're not doing user-based pricing. We got the same thing now with AI on usage, right?
Outcome-based pricing. That's what you need with agents, and that's what every VC is talking about now. It's not user-based pricing.
Really?
Yeah.
Away from usage-based.
Away from usage-based, away from user-based. It's now outcome-based.
Outcome-based. We had a really seasoned sales leader come in for a little bit, and he was all about value-based pricing, which is effectively what that is repackaged. It's about saying what's the real value of what you're doing to the customer. And ultimately, it's also how I'm thinking about pricing with Nolo. It's actually about aligning the value you deliver to what the client gets on the other side of things. All of these other metrics, like, you know, using your ERP is not like turning on electricity that you need. It's not electricity. It's far more strategic and important than that. And the usage-based models, yeah, I'm not a big fan of like charging people pounds and pennies based on how many orders they're going to do or whatever, because ultimately what you end up doing is you're going to alienate people at a certain stage. Like that model might get the most out of a small brand who didn't know what they were signing up for. And that's also where it can become a little bit of a trap. Like you see people put a system in when they're small and it's £1,000 a month, and they don't think, they never do the math of like, well, when I'm 10 million, how much am I going to be paying for this thing? They just think, well, I'll be delighted to be 10 million. So it doesn't really matter what I'm paying this thing. But oh my God, you do care how much you're paying for your systems, and you've got to watch your OpEx so closely. And so, yeah, that happens a lot. That can end up being a driver for changing system.
Pricing is always an interesting thing. And I think for us, I think it was Toby from Shopify who was talking about, as long as you are adding more value to the customer than what they're paying for, you're good.
I think that reflects, like, I think you're very fair in your pricing. With ERP, the temptation's there to charge a lot more, particularly once you've got customers through the door. You know, I talk about like renewal horror stories all the time of people who sign up for something at $2.5K a month, and a year later they get, it's $4.5K a month, and that's all right. And I think that kind of behavior is just damaging for the software industry generally. But yeah, I think you're very fair in how you think about it.
I think there's a lot of, going back to what you were talking about, for dark patterns when it comes to the software industry as well. It'll probably change, but there's quite a few of those. One of the most common ones is almost every customer that we talk to, they've been burned by previous ERP purchases.
Yeah.
And it's almost always some version of over-promising and under-delivering, or sales talking about a feature that doesn't exist or doesn't work the way it's advertised. So that's just a very, very common one. Sometimes there are genuine misunderstandings. That's different from being intentionally being oversold. Another problem that I usually see, especially when it comes to a complex product with an ecosystem, is, hey, there's this solution that requires the core product and a bunch of these other things to all work together.
Yeah.
And one vendor is making a promise on behalf of others, and which may not end up being true. We struggle with that a little bit too when it comes to peripheral things like EDI and so on,
Yeah.
where it's challenging to get even the timelines right. So there are some very challenging things about BB sales, and some of them are just dark practices. And with D2C, I think the biggest trap is almost always usage. Brands scale fast. More than any other industry, an online brand scales fast. And when you do, it shouldn't come back to bite you.
It needs to be proportionate. Like, it's okay to charge more, but it needs to be proportionate to the value you deliver. Yeah, there needs to be some concept of that economy of scale.
Yeah.
But like back to what you said on like overselling versus not knowing, like what I see is like just genuine when companies get to a certain size and the product suite is so big. And, you know, this is a common theme as well. Like the founder and that founding team are long gone and out the door, and there's an existing system and a code base. That like tacit knowledge of what works and how certain things works can start to leave. Yeah, another scenario for this is a company gets acquired and then it's being resold on their behalf.
Yeah.
You can't transfer that knowledge across. So, you know, thinking with a salesperson's head on this, like it is possible to oversell even being whiter than white, just genuinely just not, which I guess what you were saying is genuinely not knowing. But when you're a customer, if you feel like you've been oversold, you've been oversold. Whether it doesn't really matter whether it was like a genuine mistake or not. But yeah, it's a lot to learn about and figure out, particularly on bigger systems like ERP. It's still confusing for me going through stuff with certain requirements. It's a lot.
It is a lot.
The biggest challenge on big tech decisions that I see is based on the stage of the business.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this book series called The Do Lectures. It's famous here. It's probably not made its way to Canada. It might be. It's very niche. Like they're called the Do books. They've got one called Do Scale. And in that book, they talk about like what's the difference between growing a business and scaling a business.
Mm-hmm.
They introduce this concept of high quality team-based decision making. And that concept really summed up for me the difference between a bad tech decision and a great one. In a great one, you've got a team of people who are all being consulted and they're all involved. And the founder is accepting that they don't have all of the knowledge required to make a high quality decision on their own. Sometimes it could be the case that they do have all that knowledge. Like some founders are like very operational and like totally in the weeds of absolutely everything, and they get it all and they've got it. I sometimes see that though, particularly if they've got a tech background.
Yep.
Can almost create a blind spot where they think they know it all and they're too clever with it and they don't actually consult their team. Versus the key is to get the subject matter experts across the different teams and bring them all together and actually just take the time to workshop and understand what they want. Because it's often, particularly at that stage of business, what you're trying to do is find people that aren't just trying to be heroes and make their function succeed. You're looking for people who will look across into the adjacent teams and go, oh, okay, that's what you need. I know what I need, but you need your thing more. And have that, like, I think of that as like the enterprise view, where they're not just in like solo operator, I'm here to be the best I possibly can be.
Yeah. So I see some of it as red flags sometimes. Some of it is good. Like, for example, you need your team, especially the primary stakeholders, to weigh in. So they have buy-in on the decision that you're making. But if the founder, CEO, someone from the leadership is not involved in the ERP decision, we typically just want to walk away from the deal because it's going to fail. It's such a big change in how you operate that you're going to find some roadblock down the road during implementation where the team involved might not know why they do a certain thing a certain way. And there's no decision maker who remembers why they operate that way or make that change. So if that top level commitment isn't there for the change, we typically don't want to bring the customer on board because we think they wouldn't be able to change and there's no singular direction on why they are buying.
They haven't got the agency to make those quick decisions. Often with some of the processes, they've never made a team decision on how they're going to do something. and you're there saying this is the way it needs to work.
Yeah.
And they need to be able to go, that's the way we're going to work.
So in fact, we even ask when a customer is coming on board, we send a templated email to the CEO so they can distribute it within the company on why they decided to go with an ERP implementation, why this change is necessary for the next stage of growth, and so on. We need that alignment within the company, without which making such a massive change becomes hard. There's going to be somebody in the team who's going to be disappointed in the change. They liked something that they were doing before. They had more freedom. The agility of the spreadsheet, that's going away. Like, why exactly are we doing this again? So that leads to failure. So we'd rather have that change management come from the leadership down.
Yeah, there's always going to be winners and losers as well. So it's like figuring out, I think part of what we try and do, particularly like post ERP, where we do a lot of our work, is actually working out now all the dust has settled and all the change has happened. Before you go through it, it's very hard to realize what it's actually going to be like afterwards, is then actually like piecing things back together.
Yeah.
Rather than it ending up in stuff happening. The absolute worst thing that I sometimes see happening is what I call ERP theater, where the ERP, the ERP's there, but if you want to know what's really going on, don't look in the ERP.
Yeah.
So you've got people kind of doing, I call them like drug deals, where they're like, have you got the latest product file? Yeah, here you go. Sort of gets passed around the back. Oh, what products are we launching? Oh, have a look here. Rather than actually driving that data from the real-time source of, you've got how many have been ordered. It's in the ERP with the purchase orders. That's where everybody should be going, but they're not. They're relying on these little backhanded.
We see that when our implementation team starts migrating data and they're like, yes, let's start moving this data from the legacy ERP system. And they go in and like, there's no data in here. They've been using it as a glorified QuickBooks. So the ERP is implemented, but it's not being used as a single source of truth, and it's all in spreadsheets.
That's the ERP theater. So cutting across, I think where I've seen change management done really well, it's usually there's someone within that team that recognizes the change needs to happen, and they go away. Tends to be the best format. They put a presentation together and it tells the story and it brings everybody into what's going on. I remember seeing one of our first clients with Nolo. He just had like these 5 Google Sheets with the names of them, with like massive crosses going through them of like, these are all being deprecated, they're ending. And it's like literally on the day it happened, going through them all, made the owner and just turned them all off, shut everybody out of it to try and force it across. But yeah, you can't do that as a partner to someone going through a change project, either implementing Fulfil or with us Airtable. We can't be the people that do that. We call it like owning your 50.
Yeah.
And like often where we've not done so well is where we recognize a client's not quite doing their 50, and you try and go anything beyond the 50%, you're trying to do a favor or you're trying to make something happen that's not there, rather than having the tough conversation of like, this is where you're falling short.
We usually look at it as, okay, the business doesn't have the maturity to implement an ERP system. Sometimes it's because the need just isn't there.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's because we don't feel like they would be able to do the 50, their half of the work that's necessary to get successful rollout.
Yeah. And that's where the difference for you is as well. Like, you're being founder owned as an ERP vendor and owning all your integrations, which is another like remarkable strategy versus like the default in e-commerce. Everything's been very much like iPaaS led and outsourcing that. Like, it's not a core competency. You've kind of taken that opposite approach, which is remarkable. But that also means through the implementation, you're effectively the one throat to choke, I think is the term that gets thrown around.
Yes, that definitely is. And I think that's a feature. Sometimes it makes it hard, especially for customers coming from iPads and a bunch of different things. But once they see what the world looks like with a single integrated solution, it clicks.
Yeah.
Until then, it can be challenging. We want that in a way, like as much as we can be for the core part of the product. What is our core value prop? I think it should be the one throat to choke.
Yeah.
That's how it should be.
That's the point. That's the accountability piece.
Yeah.
And like that ultimately rolls back up to like what I was saying about being founder owned. And that's something I often look for in, I think it's a Naval quote, very tech bro of me to talk about Naval, but of course I've done it. I've gone there. It just talks about like the principal agent problem around, which look it up. I'm not going to try and explain it and make myself sound stupid right here, but effectively it's if you're going to work with a partner, if you're going to choose a law firm, you're better off working with like an individual lawyer or a team of 3 than going and working with a law firm with 150 people in, because you go and speak to the key person and the key person ultimately doesn't care. You're like completely lost in the mix of everything. And the person that you deal with doesn't have the agency to actually make things happen. Whereas I think that again is unique with you in that, you do get involved with clients. I've had conversations with you that are customer related and customer facing.
I think I've picked, packed, and shipped at most of our customers that operate their own warehouses. I love that part of it. I've been part of closes for most of our customers.
Yeah.
I think you would see that a big part of our way to operate is spending time with customers. We don't operate with the product roadmap. We don't operate with any of that traditional product management function. So if we are not super close to the customer, we would lose our direction. So if we have to be pointed in the right direction, we have to have the pulse on our customers. And that requires us spending a lot of time with them, spending a lot of time with our partners. That's what Matt does. That's what I do. That's what Kavir does. So a good chunk of our team, our primary focus is just spend as much time as you can with our customers and partners. The rest of it will fall into place.
Yeah, you asked me like how opinionated I am on software. How opinionated are you, would you say?
Very opinionated. There are hills we are willing to die on.
Yeah, there's a few.
Yeah. But we have also changed our mind on a few things as things have changed. But I think we're very opinionated on how brands should operate when it comes to core things like don't reinvent what a SKU is.
Yeah. But I think it's like a person, isn't it? Like you start when you're young and you're like hungry and you're taking on the world. Like there's more hills that you're prepared to die on. I think like gradually over time, like you soften to some of them that are a bit more peripheral, but I'm really like in my new space with Nolo, I'm discovering my hills that I'm prepared to die on. Like one I was talking to someone about the other day was people often ask us about doing PIM because they see the end of the product date. I call it the product data challenge, where they're trying to get everything up to the website. This particular brand, they'd actually already tried to solve the problem and failed once. And they were asking me to tackle it. And the root cause of why it had failed was they actually hadn't got product design and everyone else involved at an early enough stage. So my thing is, I think you've got to sort the product master data at the root source before you go and do PIM. Because otherwise, and we've even done a project like this, you're uploading Excel files or Google Sheets into a PIM. And you like, how did all the data get into the file in the first place? Yeah, exactly. And then you're going to have errors or issues or whatever.
Your philosophy is PLM before PIM. Is that common for all brands or is it just for this specific case?
I mean, no one's going to know what PLM before PIM means, but yeah, master product data before you try and integrate it into your e-commerce platforms and your sales channels.
Why is that important? Look, give me a practical example. Like what kind of problems are there when they don't do this in the right order?
So if you don't do it in the right order, the PIM solution, product information management, and that whole category just focuses on one team in a business, e-commerce manager or e-commerce assistant, basically. And all the e-commerce assistant is thinking about is they take a file or multiple files from a few different stakeholders in the business, smash them together, format it for Shopify, probably with ChatGPT now, prep their Matrixify upload, and then upload it into Shopify. That's the problem that they think about it as. And so when you log into a lot of the PIM solutions I've seen, the first thing that you need to do, you need to upload your files and you need to do the enrichment. And the truth of it is that if you map that whole thing end to end, you realize that product data starts its journey much earlier and it is being enriched along the way. And it's not just that e-commerce needed that product information to get it onto the website. Marketing needed it to plan their email long before e-commerce needed it to put it on the website. They needed to know the RRP, but they didn't have that information either. And the CRM team didn't have the information that they needed. So people get drawn into solving one really specific problem. And actually, when you break it out with the same amount of effort, you can solve a problem for a lot more people.
Let's dig a level deeper.
Yeah.
Who should set up the product? Where should this start? Should this start the first time a PO is sent out? Should this start the first time someone gets this idea that, hey, we should launch a product of this type? When should this product information, when should the first piece of information come together?
As early as possible. As early as possible in the life cycle. Because from a merchandising perspective, you're planning what you're going to be launching, and you're effectively setting design with a task of making a certain number of styles that fit into certain categories, and that all needs to roll up back up into the merchandising forecast. So design needs to be told what to produce, and designers are creatives, and that means they all like working off in their own different ways. But merchandisers still need to know what's going on. And if design are late, and design are always late, they're literally always the latest because it's creative, right? So we need to go to Paris to be inspired, and then we need to come back, and then we're going to work out what we're doing on that collection. Like, true story. This is what's going on. But that's the magic, right? This is the innovation center. So like, we can laugh about it, but that's also where the money's being made in the product. So design's hard, and they're under pressure, and creative people don't like time zones and structures and rigid stuff. They like big Miro boards where they're like moving designs and styles around and stuff. So just finding a way to get design to put a CAD and a name against the style as soon as they've got that idea, as early in the process as possible, is the best place. Because once it's in there, you can give everybody else visibility into what's coming. So merchandise know that they're behind.
So merchandising is sort of taking up the responsibility for making sure that there is a product, there's a SKU, there's a style, there's something that starts as product information.
It varies, but like, ideally, design at the start of the process, just creating the idea of a style and putting a CAD in, and then often it gets passed down through the teams, and there's enrichment by different teams. Some teams get the production team to generate the SKU code, others have merchandising do it. Doesn't really matter so much as long as you're not actually there with like fat fingers typing in the SKU codes, and you're not doing color codes in the wrong way.
And you don't have two teams giving it completely different.
And you haven't got two teams, and you're not working off two different SKU files, and you're not manually pasting in your GS1 barcodes.
Yeah.
And repeating barcodes. That was the other one I've seen, is like, a GS1 barcode, like, I don't even know what a barcode costs, but it's like not even, it's probably like pennies. Any time that like a size range got changed. So say they go, we're going to do this in extra small to extra large, and the extra large got cancelled. They were taking the barcode
off the extra
large and putting it back into the barcode part. And there's only one outcome from that: duplicate barcodes.
Yeah.
Stuff arriving and then needing to do relabeling, which is painful.
I think usually only brands realize the problems with this when they have circulation of these products outside their network. Like, the moment the inventory reaches someone like Nordstrom, that's when you start realizing when the UPCs are reused, or when you're listing the product on Amazon with the UPC, and now you have duplicate UPCs. And
it's probably why it's become bigger in like the last 2-3 years, as brands have started to, there was a little period where you had like Gymshark blowing up, and the whole story was around their cash conversion cycle, how brilliant it was, and how they're doing everything direct, and they don't do retail, and they don't do wholesale. And that was like the big disruption thing. And there's a lot of brands, particularly in the UK, that just saw that story, saw it was possible. And even just within Birmingham, just the fact that Gymshark did it made a couple of other businesses happen. I don't know what it is. It's like something gets in the water, and people see like, this can be done, and they're just about, they know someone that's in there. So they just feel like it's possible, and they make it happen. There's been a lot of success stories of it, but in the wake of that, who cares about SKU codes and barcodes? Because everyone's selling everything direct. Whereas now, some of my shrewdest clients, going back even 3-4 years, were sticking with wholesale, whilst many people would have advised away from it, and said, you need to go 100% e-commerce because that's what's worked for these other companies. There was a few who kind of stuck with wholesale and have made it work for them. But for that, you need the SKU codes, you need the barcodes. So it's always an interesting one. Like, do you have barcodes? No, we don't have barcodes. Or we do have barcodes, but they're just our SKU codes. And you look at the SKU codes, the SKU code's bad. You look at the barcodes, you're like, Dots and dashes. Have you come across that yet in the barcodes? Yeah. So it's like dashes make it really long.
We recently had brought on board a customer where there's no barcode. There's a QR code, which is not a problem as long as if you scan the QR code, if the SKU is encoded in there, right? Nope. This ended up being the URL of the product in there, and that's the only identifier. So it's great. The customer can scan the QR code and it launches the product on the website. But from a warehouse management perspective, that's just brutal. So first thing that you'll need is insanely good barcode scanners, because these are giant blobs of text that you're scanning with a scanner.
Yeah.
And you are limited to the kind of hardware that you can use because you're reading a big chunk of text. And you will see it spin for a second because it's this massive text that it's comparing across the database to find out what is the SKU.
You've changed that?
No.
That's how they're running.
Yes. Fortunately, Fulfil supports something called alternate codes, other codes that you can add to each product.
Yeah.
So the full URL is how
You've left it.
Yeah. An alternate
Why
code.
do they want that then? Was it literally so customers could scan a barcode and find the product online?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's good.
You obviously can't do that through retail. Are they sending it through to retail?
No, this is direct to consumer.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say. Otherwise, you could be like, it's the dream, isn't it? Selling Nordstrom, and then people are in Nordstrom taking photos of it and just buying it online. I don't know how long you'd get away with that for. Probably not very long. So how long have you been seriously thinking about the UK then as a, like, I guess it's not even it's technically a third market for you, right? After Canada, US.
Yeah, US and Canada were the primary markets for us. We have had customers in the UK for a long time, but we've had them because they had a pressing problem that nobody else solved.
Yeah.
Not because we were primarily targeting the UK market.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we're bringing on board more and more brands here, we are building out more and more UK specific things.
Yeah.
There are quite a few.
Yeah. I think there's the real gap I spotted with you straight away was around, there's been a on-premise ERP I came across, like going back right to the start of my career. It's called Orderwise. It's been like, I think it's been acquired now a couple of times over. I don't think it's up to too much, but the nature of legacy tech is it's always kicking around. But that space of like something that can do e-commerce but can also do the light manufacturing and like the production stuff, and always when the light manufacturing, the production stuff's in play, people want to do it on mobile. And I just remember I'd always come across that with Peoplevox. Like we were always very focused on like finished goods and doing that part of the warehouse and the fulfillment really well. But that was the piece where, you know, bill of materials and components, whatever, it's another layer of complexity that does need that more of an ERP approach to solving it.
Yeah. For brands, bill of materials is needed in two different situations. One could just be the light manufacturing kind of thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's also bundling and assembly and so on. So you could think of it as a traditional sense, okay, a kit that you put together when you ship, but many brands also put a bundle of their items together from different vendors and assemble them and put them on the shelf too. So it's a requirement for most brands at scale.
Yeah.
Light manufacturing, I think it's going to be the way, especially with all of the changes that's happening around tariffs and so on. I think we'll end up seeing a lot more of that, especially stateside and so on.
Yeah, it's going to boom. Like, I don't know how many touches people have to make on a product to say it's quite strict in the US at the moment, isn't it? I think the UK
US is super strict.
The UK is a bit more flexible. I think it's like 2 touches on a product. So I was joking with someone about, they were saying, we'll make shirts without buttons.
And
so choose your buttons. Well, choose your buttons and we'll sew the buttons on for you. So that would be like the button snap and then a little bit of tailoring, and you've done your 2 changes to be made in the UK. So
interesting.
That's like one potential option. And then how are you thinking about like what the UK market needs? Like, what have you observed so far from your UK customers as being like a particular challenge generally for an ERP that's coming over here? And then also like, what are the kind of nuances you're seeing?
I think the big things that we're seeing is mostly around finance functions. So for example, in the US, when we integrate with banks, it's just Plaid, Teller, Stripe, different ways. Most of them scrape the websites of banks to give you bank statement information and so on. UK makes it a lot easier and difficult at the same time. So UK has open banking, so we have to use the open banking APIs. That's a good part. but it also bites you back because we have always had an integration with something like Wise. Outside the UK, it works great. The API is enough for us to create payments, get transactions, and so on. But in the UK, we have to use an open banking API to get the exact same Wise transactions. So good and bad. I think most surprises are like that. US's sales tax is very interesting.
Yeah.
Most states charge a sales tax. Some states are destination based, which means the tax rate is going to depend on where your customer lives. And some states have a state level tax, a county level tax, a city level tax. Sometimes there's a special assessment. You ship a product to someone living in LA, you'll see like 3 to 4 different taxes that apply. And you're remitting taxes to all of these different jurisdictions. So it's natural for you to have a product like Avalara or TaxJar or Numeral that helps you remit taxes to all of these entities. In the UK, you have HMRC. So we don't have an integration with HMRC yet. So we're relying on our partners to do that. So those are the kind of gaps that we are seeing that we'll have to fill pretty quickly to work like the product does in the US.
And that's the bar, I guess, just getting it to if you can just get it to where the product is in the US, you're not trading off and feeling frustrated as well. Because as well for you, you know what it's capable of. And to some degree, it feels done to a level. And then you come over here and it's it's almost going back in time in terms of feeling ready and confidence and everything.
But end of the day, what we expected would be big challenges turned out to be no problems at all. If you think about how DTC sales happens, the big difference between the US and the UK is really how the unit price shows up. Unit prices here, inclusive of VAT. Unit prices stateside or even in Canada before tax.
Right.
So tax gets added at checkout.
Yeah.
So even for brands that use something like Shopify, it isn't that elegantly handled. But those are the things that we expected would be bigger things. But those turned out to be super easy things to handle.
Yeah. So just the UK in terms of a focus at the moment, then not thinking about making your way into Spain and France.
Absolutely not.
Germany.
No.
It's a lot. Even just, I was saying to you about what we're doing with Nolo, taking that into the US, there's so little that we have to think about nationalizing. Sure, we need people there. We started that process, but we don't then need to, in the Peoplevox world, we went over to Australia and it was all these new parcel carriers. You must have the parcel carrier challenge. But even with something like parcel carriers, a lot of the challenges now are there'll be a shipping API somewhere that can do 90% of it. And then there's another 10% that you need to cover off anyway. It's never going to be an end of it. And then marketplaces, crazy numbers of random marketplaces, the other weirdness.
True, which is true. With Australia, I get an email from somebody in Australia every week or so asking if we can support the product there.
Really, really nice market.
It is, but it's a tough market for us to serve well because we do all of our implementations, right? So we need an implementation team that can work that time zone. We have round-the-clock support, but not an implementation team or an account management team.
It's a different level of knowledge that you need in the team. And it's not just we've been through this. It's not just having your product expert. You need the coordinator and you need a few people involved, right? It's not just, can't just have one superhero that goes, I'm going to go and do Australia and I'll do all these implementations. It's a single point of failure.
And for us as a company too, having resources in having team members in Australia or New Zealand is very minimal overlap. Keeping the company culture, all of that ends up being a whole new challenge, which I don't think we want to take on at this point.
Yeah, makes sense. It's nice though when you fancy
some
a trip.
Amazing brands there.
Amazing brands. They've got, I don't know what it is about what they've got. I think it's just the sunshine and the beach culture, but they just seem to be able to make incredible brands. They've pound for pound, they are well above their weight in terms of I mentioned Princess Polly, but creating brands and then shipping them internationally. There's a whole load, particularly in the fashion space, where they're just massive. You get it a lot with Scandinavian brands as well, right? They exhaust their home market really quick. And then they're right, we need to go international. So they take on a lot of those challenges earlier.
Yeah.
So what are you what are you hoping for from these? We're going to do 10 in this series, right? This is official episode 1. What do you think? What are you hoping for from the next 9? What do you want to get out of it?
I think I want to hear from operators, people we don't hear from usually, people who can go into the details of how they solve specific problems And I think for us to just be curious, sit there and just go deeper and deeper and learn the frameworks they used, the challenges they ran into,
Yeah,
and the war stories.
I'm hoping to learn stuff. That's what I enjoy doing. That's why I do still get dragged into doing bits where I'm looking at tech for people. And I think we've picked out a few people that I'm following online that I've never even spoken to. We were talking about a few earlier, and I just look at the topic and I'm like, oh my God, I'd love to hear what they've got to say. So hopefully we've got a platform here where we can get them on and go a little bit deeper with some of them. Also give them a platform as well. If you're in that back-end supply chain world, you are kind of to some degree behind the scenes and a bit of an unsung hero on some of these bits. So I don't know many supply chain people that are building out there trying to build a personal brand or whatever. So
yeah, and those are the guys and girls who lose sleep over Black Friday and Cyber Monday, getting these orders out, getting the POs in, and let's hear from them.
Yeah, cool.